Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual event, inspiring Our Stories, Our Voices. My name is Brooke Campbell, and I'm the Acting Director of Programs at Canada's National History Society. I'm so excited to be joined by all of you, and I'm honored to be able to introduce this session. Canada's National History Society recognizes First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of Canada as traditional stewards of the land. The Society is located in Winnipeg, Manitoba, on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and it's the homeland of the Métis Nation. Now, I'm currently in Canmore, Alberta, and I want to acknowledge that I'm streaming this event from the territory known as Treaty 7, which is a treaty signed on behalf of Queen Victoria in 1877 with the Stoney Nakoda, Blackfoot Confederacy, and Tsuut'ina Nations. It's been a very exciting spring at Canada's National History Society with the launch of a new contest called Our Stories, Our Voices. We are grateful to the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support of this program. Now, throughout today's presentation, I hope you think about some of the histories in your communities that you want others to know about. And remember that you can submit them to Canada's History Society for a chance to win a seat at a virtual youth forum this summer. Now, engagement with our audience is incredibly important to us, and we will be using Zoom to help us with this. So at any time, please type in a question you'd like to ask to our presenter in the Q&A feature of Zoom. You should see that box just at the bottom of your screen. And we will be asking them that during the Q&A segment. Now, if there's a particular question that you would like answered, you can upvote it by giving it the thumbs up. You're also able to leave comments and can engage in a discussion using the chat box. We also wanted to let you know that we will be recording this presentation and sharing it online after, so please feel free to comment or to ask questions anonymously as well. Today's event features a presentation from Rito Joseph, a self-taught guest speaker and tour guide and founder of Black Montreal Experiences, where he offers guided discoveries of Montreal's connection to Black history and its impact on today's society. We will also be joined by two members of the Canada's History Youth Committee, Madeleine Vervate and Christine Jean-Julien, who will help facilitate today's Q&A session. So at this time, I'd love to welcome Rito and invite him to begin his presentation.
Hi, thanks a lot, Brooke. Thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to be here today with you guys. Today, we will be looking at the early years in Canadian history, and we will see it from an Afro-descendant's perspective, from the early years until the British Conquest. I will be sharing my screen in a few seconds. Since Brooke already done the land acknowledgement, I just want to say I'm in Jojage in Montreal, which historically is a gathering place for the First Nations, Huron, Iroquois, Algonquin, Ojibwe, just to name a few. And we will start the presentation by looking at the early years in Canadian history, early years of Canada from an Afro-descendant's perspective. Some of the symbolism we'll be looking at in New France, Nouvelle-France, New France, Mathieu de Costa, Olivier Lejeune, the foundation of Ville-Marie, Marie-Joseph Angélique, and the British Conquest itself. Okay, so we said that most of this land known as Montreal, where the country originally started, is known as Jojage, Skanawoti. So it's a place where the tribes or different peoples met to, at times, not only to harvest the land, but to organize in the sense that at times it's to have meetings, to trade the fur as well, a fur trading spot, a place where, at the foot of a mountain, you had mostly Mohawks living there as well. They've been living there for the 10, 15,000s of years prior to Jacques Cartier arriving on the island, which is nowadays known as Montreal. 1534, where he met a peoples, that had their villages at the foot of a mountain, which presumably today is Mount Royal. Overheard the name Okalaga, in French Hochelaga, so a neighborhood still this day in Montreal bears the name. Just a segue to take us where we want to go. Jacques Cartier will also overhear the word Canada, which is where they say the name Canada comes from, which meant village in Nord Iroquois. He would come back in 1535 again, along with Sieur de Roberval. He would go to Quebec City, which was known as the Dacona, Montreal. He would look for the village, wouldn't find the village. And from the 1530s, this is where the history of European colonization of Canada starts. Of course, the French are not the first Europeans to explore Canada. People talk about how the Vikings had been here before, but as of more recently, the Portuguese had been to Canada before. You have explorers such as Labrador, which still is named. There's a province that bears his name. So he was a Portuguese explorer. He made it near Newfoundland around 1490s. So when Jacques Cartier arrives in Montreal, he knows that this is a place where Europeans go for fishing. There's a little reputation about the weather as well, but he doesn't quite know much. From Jacques Cartier on, that would take us to the first person we said we would talk about, Mathieu de Costa. Mathieu de Costa is the first registered Black person in Canada, circa 1603, 1604. So 4 to 5 years prior to the foundation of Quebec City, which is the oldest city in North America, north of Mexico, let's say. And Mathieu de Costa was a navigator, translator, linguist, spoke many languages: French, Dutch, indigenous language, Mi'kmaq, Portuguese. His roots go back to the Kingdom of Congo, Azores Islands on the coast of Africa. Of course, considered the Moors in Iberian Peninsula in those days. Mathieu de Costa would be the one that would introduce Samuel de Champlain to the First Nations, the Mi'kmaq nations, which they met. So again, this is prior to the founding of Quebec City. So we see that there's a history of multiculturalism at the genesis of this nation known as Canada. So this is still circa 1605, 1608, 1606, Port Royal. Mathieu de Costa would accompany Samuel de Champlain and Pierre Dugas-Desmonts on to all of their mission as well. He would end up in jail. He was kidnapped by the Dutch. He had accepted 2 contracts. So this business of translating was really lucrative in those days at sea, especially for people of African descent. So we can think of the Nino brothers along with Christopher Columbus. We can also think of different Moors that throughout history were part of the travels. So he's going to be in jail in the Netherlands. So he gets kidnapped for accepting a contract from the Dutch while working for the French. While there, he would learn how to speak Dutch, and he would use it as well. So not much is known about Mathieu de Costa's background, but we know that his history goes back to 3 continents simultaneously, and he's one of the first 2-3 characters of Canadian history, and we rarely know about him. So nowadays we know a lot about Champlain and the travels, and he's revered and throughout Northeast America. So Montreal, Quebec, upstate New York, Champlain Lake, Champlain College, Valley, but not much is known about Mathieu de Costa. And so with de Costa, with the French introducing themselves, that would take us to Seas of Quebec, 1628, Prise de Québec, which is called in French. Seas of Quebec by the Kirk brothers in 1628. So Samuel de Champlain is the governor of Quebec City, which is, excuse me, not the capital of New France, but it's the main city at that time. More than Montreal, definitely. 1628, they seized Quebec City. The Kirk brothers had just came from Africa on their way of seizing Quebec City. Champlain goes into exile in London, and for 2-3 years, the Kirk brothers have the city of Quebec. They bring in a little man with them, which in those days they called a little Negro boy of African descent, by the name of we don't know his name yet, but he brings him along to stay with Le Bailly. So Le Bailly would be a trader, French merchant who worked on behalf of the British in those days. So he's considered a trader in you know, in the community. He would hold on to that enslaved little man of African descent, a little boy of African descent, until Champlain comes back to the city. And then the Kirk brothers are forced to leave and give back the city they had seized 2, 3 years ago. Le Bailly is forced to leave with them. He would leave this little boy with Guillaume Couillard. Guillaume Couillard would be in charge of this little boy. He would then put him at the school of the Jesuit, Paul Lejeune, where he would gain the name Olivier Lejeune. So Olivier comes from his first or second masters, Olivier Le Bailly, and then Lejeune from Father Lejeune, who would educate him. But meanwhile, in the meantime, he belonged to Guillaume Couillard. So Guillaume Couillard is also the direct ancestor of ex-Prime Minister of Quebec, Philippe Couillard. So he was the one just before we had Legault. It was Guillaume Couillard. So this is his direct ancestor. Excuse me, it was Philippe Couillard. His direct ancestor is Guillaume Couillard, which owned the first enslaved or the first registered enslaved person of African descent in the history of Quebec, the province of New France, or Canada for that matter. There I have archives from historian Marcel Trudel, which I'm going to translate for you real quick. So it says, un nègre chez Guillaume Couillard, so a Negro at Guillaume Couillard's home. The first enslaved person that we can identify in Canada or French Canada is a little Negro boy brought in Quebec City by the Kirk brothers in 1629. He came from Madagascar, or another version says Guinea. Between those two countries, there's a whole continent, but it doesn't really matter. The origin, the ethnic origin doesn't really matter here because the detail doesn't change nothing to the fact that he's in servitude. So belonged to one of the three Kirk brothers. A little Negro boy is sold for 50 EQ, 50 EQ. Nowadays, I'm not sure how much it is worth. I believe it's around maybe what would be known as maybe $200 Canadian, let's say. French merchant that was giving to the British in July 1632 when the British put a term to the occupation of Quebec. The Treaty Le Bailly gives this little Negro boy to Guillaume Couillard as a gift. His new master put him in a Jesuit school. Lejeune and a missionary in 1638 wrote, "I became regent in Canada, so I became teacher. I had the other day a little savage on one side and a little Negro or more on the other." So a savage, you guys presumably know that he's talking about indigenous people, native tribes, native people in those days, which they mostly called the savages, the Pawnees, which they traded. They went in the Midwest again, near the Missouri. So it says a little savage on one side, a little Negro boy or more on the others, to whom I was teaching the letters. After so many years of regents or teaching, I'm finally back to the ABCs, but with little enchantment and, but with a great enchantment and satisfaction. So much that I wouldn't trade my two students for the greatest audience in France. Thus, this is how Father Lejeune inaugurated the teachings of the Jesuit in the St. Lawrence Valley, having for first students a savage and a Negro. So a little savage and a little Negro, just to say. So it's rooted in our Canadian history. The first stages of education or how it was perceived by the Jesuit came through slavery, owning and enslaved native and also person of African descent. These are taken from Marcel Trudel's archives. Trudel was one of the first French Canadian historians to thoroughly research about not only Canadian slavery, but Black people living in Quebec and Canada in those days. So again, this is prior to the British Conquest. So we're still in the 1630s, and this is how the first teachings of whatever now is going to be known as a school system is inaugurated through having those enslaved entities. 1642, founding of Ville-Marie, Fondation de Ville-Marie, Foundation of Ville-Marie. So this would be, a project from Société NotreDame de Montréal. Society NotreDame of Montreal is a group of people that had a religious military mission to convert the heathens or quote unquote the savages, in which was one of the goals of the society. Some of the people that belonged to that society were people such as Paul Cheminade de Maisonneuve, which is known as a co-founder of Ville-Marie of Montreal, along with Jeanne Mance, names that you might have seen, La Dauversière, or even if you don't know, but you know, when you go to Montreal, there are a lot of these names, Lambert Claus, and essentially they funded or they had a dream about, you know, going to convert the savages on the other side of the ocean, you know, because they needed, you know, that light. Les véritables motifs des messieurs et dames de la Société Notre-Dame de Montréal pour la conversion des sauvages de la Nouvelle-France. So this is a book that came out in 1643. The motive, the true motives of the ladies and gentlemen of the Society NotreDame of Montreal for the conversion of the savages in New France. And mind you guys, a lot of those informations are only in French because, you know, it goes back to pre British Conquest Canada. So, you know, this part of the history also has to be thoroughly researched in order for us to understand certain, some of what's going on today. Near in 1644, near what would be called now Place d'Armes in Montreal, for those of you who've been to old Montreal, there's a place called Place d'Armes right in front of the Notre-Dame Basilica Church, and this is a place where they show that you know, the French or the Frenchmen or the French army defeated the Iroquois. So the Iroquois, they defeated them. They show that, you know, right now, you know, it's killing one of them. This is right next to proximity to a place where, you know, we gave it the name Place d'Armes, so place of arms. The founders of Ville Marie, you know, I guess would say fought battled the Iroquois, which, you know, they won the battle in March 1644. You see, just so you guys understand that there's still a piece of that history that's closely linked to what's going on nowadays near that Place d'Armes. So, Société Notre-Dame de Montréal pour la conversion des sauvages en Nouvelle-France. Society NotreDame of Montreal for the conversion of the savages in New France was the name of the society that came, and they talked about how, you know, colonization, European colonization of settlements started in Canada. This would lead us to a book called the Black Code, the Code Noir. So the Code Noir was a set of book regulations on, you know, like kind of like a Bible, laws on how to regulate your enslaved people, your free people of color, enslaved people of African descent or indigenous in the French colonies. Again, this doesn't only necessarily apply to New France, because when we talk about the French colonies, we're also talking about what's going on in the Caribbean, Louisiana. However, it doesn't mean that it wasn't used here. It was used here several times, though it wasn't officially applied here. This Bible, which said, you know, this Code Noir, this book, you know, kind of like a Bible, reminiscing of a Bible. It taught people how to, you know, treat their enslaved people, right? So if, let's say, for example, you bought a slave, you went to a slave market and you bought a slave, you had to baptize him in your religion, which is a French Catholic religion. So he had to speak French. If that enslaved person, let's say you had to cut his hair, if that enslaved person tried to run away, you would catch them. You can brand them as you wish. If that person, let's say, committed another crime, any type of crime, this book showed you, taught you, helped you on how to treat your enslaved people and how to regulate them as well. It was established by this man right here, which is known as the Roi Soleil, King Sun, Louis XIV, Louis XIV. As you guys could see, he bears the logo or the symbol of fleur de lis, which is a French monarchy symbol, which is also to this day a symbol that's known to be linked with, you know, French symbolism, right? Let's say anytime we see a fleur de lis, it's related to somehow, some way it's related to French history, right? Whether it's in Quebec, Louisiana, or any elsewhere, when we see a fleur de lis, most of the time we feel like it's rooted in something French. So the Black Code was established by Colbert, but, you know, I guess it was co-signed by Louis XIV, which was the king in those days, which is one of the, you know, longest reign in French history. Right here we have the fleur de lis, the fugitive slave who has been on the run for 1 month from the day his master reported him to the police shall have his ear cut off and shall be branded with a fleur de lis on one shoulder. If he commits the same infraction for another month, again counting from the day he is reported, he shall have his arm string cut and be branded with a fleur-de-lis on the other shoulder. The third time he shall be put to death. Article 38 of the Louisiana Black Code. So again, we see how the fleur-de-lis was being branded like a hot iron on enslaved people, whether of African descent or indigenous people too. So that also happened here in Canada. On the public square, you know, people would put on the pillory as well, branding them with the fleur-de-lis. So that also happened here in New France in Canada. And this is a piece of history we rarely get to talk about, we rarely get to see. And I feel like if we have a deeper understanding of what took place in those days, it can help us a lot too. The fleur-de-lis would take us also to, you know, understanding a little bit of symbolism in terms of the flag, national symbol. What we see on the left side is the flag of the French Kingdom, which started in the 1530s, which was still used in Quebec in those days. So we see the Stella Cross in the middle, the fleur-de-lis in the middle, there's a scepter, two scepters, etc. The crown. On the right side, we see the four snakes, so the four serpent flag of the colonial flag of Martinique, which was in use since the 1760s, which was used because they said that when they put snake at the outer skirt of the island, it would stop the runaway slave from, you know, it would stop them from leaving the island. So they say these snakes, you know, they say they had venom, so when they would bite you, could be dangerous. So I'm not really sure if it was a myth or if it was used. I'm not sure why it would be a myth. So this is a flag that was used, you know, started by pirates. It was used as a colonial flag in Martinique until the 1960s when Aimé Césaire brought up the red, black, and green flag. I say this to say too, when you look at the French flag, you look at the flag from Martinique, these are a part of the same, I guess, you know, they're part of the same kingdom, the French kingdom. And I think it's important to understand also some of the history too, because nowadays, this is the flag of Quebec, for example. And we rarely take time maybe to understand what the fleur-de-lis represents, you know, as an historical, you know, symbol, you know, more than just national ethno-linguistic symbol, let's say, per se. Again, in the 1680s, Montreal, this is what it looks like. Early beginning of Canada, what would be known as Canada, we see Mount Royal. And then further outside of Mount Royal, you know, Les Pays d'en Haut, which is, you know, that's where you would go to, you know, explore, I guess, if you want to explore Ontario, you want to explore behind the mountain. 1688, Governor de Norville, Intendant Bouchard, they're asking to have Negroes for, you know, for workforce. They're asking Negroes for workforce. So, okay, so Rito consacre une partie de leur mémoire. So they're asking a letter, they're asking a memoir to make the crowd understand the necessity of having Negro slaves in Canada, you know, so it would be a good way to manufacture. If we fear that they do not survive in the weather and the climate, there's a strategy of, you know, putting, you know, the fur on them. So putting beaver fur on them, that would produce a double effect. It would keep them warm, and also because the fur has already been used, and you know it gains. So the fur itself, when it's used, you know, it gains in value. So then when you put it on the market, you can double the price for the fur and also have labor for free. So in these conditions, you know, we wouldn't spend any money on them to keep them warm, and also we would be making a lot of money with the fur. The king was he was about to authorize it, but then a war happened. And again, just so you guys understand also some of the circumstances of the early years in Canada. So yeah, so the colonial commerce, there's a war going on, so we can't bring them, we can't bring you know, shipping of enslaved Negroes. So we can't send, you know, we can't invest money into sending ships to Africa directly from Africa. So we've never had slave ships coming from Africa to Canada. However, a lot of the slave ships that were used, or some of them that were used during those days, were also built in Canada, some in Newfoundland, some in Quebec City, some in the Maritimes. Okay, so the peace with New France. So I just want you guys to understand too a little bit of how the request throughout history, the request to, you know, have people also, working with, seniors, on des nègres pour travailler sur terre. If we have Negroes to work on land, then our older folks, wouldn't be working in conditions that would bring all sorts of harm. And then, we'd have people to take care of them too. In 1709, Intendant Rondeau officially made that request. This would take us, to Marie-Joseph Angélique, which, maybe some of you guys have heard of. Marie-Joseph Angélique is this Black woman that was accused of setting the city of Montreal on fire in 1734. She was born in Madeira, on the west coast of Africa, which is the Department of Portugal near the Iberian Peninsula. She was kidnapped at the age of 12. She was brought up in a slave market in Lisbon. And then she was bought by a merchant by the name of Nicholas Back, if I'm not mistaken, a Flemish merchant who brought her to New England. When she went to New England, she stayed there for a few years, and then a French merchant or French-Canadian merchant by the name of François Poulain de Francheville would go New England. He would buy her and would bring her to Montreal in those days, which was part of New France. While in Montreal, so by the time she arrived to Montreal, she had already been sold 3 times. She spoke multiple languages, Portuguese, Dutch, knowledge of English. When she arrives in Montreal, she gets rebaptized for the 3rd or 4th time. Now she bears a new name, Marie-Joseph Angélique. She's not really loved in her community, not because of her social status, which has a lot to do with it, but also because they say she doesn't behave like an enslaved person, and she mostly sees herself as a servant, which a lot of the sources say she had a attitude. So, there's also a myth of the angry Black woman, which, dates back from the colonial days as well, which, I think we need to pay attention to when, looking at history. Marie-Joseph Angélique would be forced to breed with another enslaved person while she was living in Montreal with Jacques César, which belonged to Ignace Gamelin. Marie-Joseph Angélique would also have a boyfriend. She would lose those 2 children, actually, infant. They would die infant each. Marie-Joseph Angélique would also have another boyfriend by the name of Claude Thibault, which was a small-time criminal from France, European, Caucasian. And also in the communities, a lot of people didn't really like that. So there you have a person that's supposed to be enslaved in a not so advanced society, but then when she gets there, she's one of the people she appears to be emancipated, and people appear to have a problem with it, not because she's harming them, but because it feels like she's been free before. So Marie-Joseph Angélique was promised freedom by her, I guess you could say, her slave owner, François Poulain de Francheville, before he died, but he died at a young age. I think he might have been in his late 30s, mid-late 30s when he died. So she was never given her freedom. Then she belonged to the widow, Thérèse Coin de Francheville, which wouldn't let her go for free, sold her to another slave owner in Quebec City, or Trois-Rivières. Of course, in those days, people had to wait for the sea, to start melting before, going on these routes. So she stayed. She attempted, to escape. So it wasn't her first time attempting to escape. She tried to escape once with Claude Thibault. That did not work. This time around, she promised that, she said she would burn the town and leave and go to New England, and then hop on a boat to go back to Portugal. Of course, when the fire happened, the words were not being taken lightly. So 20-something people went to court and testified against her. The fire happened on April 10th, and between April 10th and June 21st, 20-something people went to court and testified against her. None of them had seen her set the fire. Marie-Joseph Angélique would then be taken in for questioning. When she gets taken in for questioning, they put the boot. So this is a torture machine. I guess you could call it a machine, which they tie your knees and your feet. As you guys can see, they put a little wooden pieces in between, and then they hit on your knee. They hit on your knees with a hammer. In French, it's called a brodequin. So Marie-Joseph Angélique would be questioned. Now, they didn't question her in terms of wanting to know, did she do it or not? They said, who did you act with? Because she was seen around with her boyfriend a few days prior to this fire taking place. Um, People had testified that it was her, whether they had proofs or not. So Marie-Joseph Angelique then said she did not do it. They hit on that hammer, you know. It's a lot of pain for her to handle. She still wouldn't confess. They hit a second time. They hit a second time. The pain is too much for her to handle. And then they get what they I guess they say she admitted. She said, I not only did I do it, I want to be executed now because this is a lot of pain to handle. So they say she finally admits. So they take Marie-Joseph Angelique, they put her in the back of a horse carriage. They bring her in front of the church, NotreDame Basilique Notre-Dame in Montreal, Old Montreal. So she can repent to the king, to God, to the people. They put her back at they put her back at the back of the horse carriage, parading her throughout the community. People yelling slurs at her. People spin at her. She's going on. They bring on a public place. This is June 21st, 1734. She's being executed at right now on the public square. She's being executed. They hang her. And then they let the body hang for 2 hours, and then they put it at the back. And then they burn her afterwards. So she's being burned at stake after she was executed, after she was hanged, and then they scattered the ashes in the wind. They spread the ashes in the wind in order to erase the memory. So Marie-Joseph Angelique's story resurfaced early 20th centuries. With historians such as Marcel Trudel, but a lot of other people, Paul Fému-Brown researched on that, Dorothy Williams, Dr. Afro Cooper wrote The Hanging of Marie-Joseph Angelique, which he researched for 20 years. So nowadays, there's a little plaque to commemorate her in Old Montreal, but it's hidden. And not even though a lot of people know about her, not as many people do know about her story. They might have heard the name, they might have seen, maybe like a play about her, but they don't know much of the oppression that was. They don't know much of that oppression that was. It was directly linked to. The colonial establishment of Kingdom of France in those days. So this is what they said St. Paul Street, where she lived and where she walked in, looked like. That's me right there walking. Just so you guys see, when you come to Montreal, I'll take you on a tour there. And then the executioner was Mathieu Léveillé. Mathieu Léveillé was also a person of African descent. That was the guy that got deported from Martinique. He was born enslaved in Martinique. He was a runaway slave that was tatted with 2 fleurs de lis. So he tried to escape once. Well, he tried to escape many times, but that time they burned him with a fleur de lis. The second time when they caught him, they were going to execute him. But then New France was in need of an executioner. And Mathieu Léveillé had heard about, had seen some of his friends, marooned friends in Martinique, get executed for running away. So he was given a position. He was offered life or death, right? Either you live and you kill, or you get killed on sight. Or I guess maybe not on sight, but you'll be next because you're a runaway slave under the French, le Code Noir that was established in French, like we saw in those days. So Mathieu Léveillé gets deported in New France in 1733 as the new executioner in the country. So Mathieu Léveillé would then be the first Black person or the first person of African descent, historically speaking, to work in a public function here in Canada. Mathieu Léveillé would be his first job would be Marie-Joseph Angelique, whom he would befriend. And while she was detained, Mathieu Léveillé would befriend Marie-Joseph Angelique. But at the same time, that was his first job. He's the one that tortured her when she gets hanged. He's the one that does the job. She's the one that burns her. I'm not sure he's the one that scattered the ashes in the wind, however, and of course he wasn't the judge that took her to court, nor did he testify because he wasn't there when that happened. He stayed in Quebec City. And he worked between Quebec City, Montreal, and Trois-Rivières. Quebec City, but this job was it was becoming a lot for him. So he fell into a deep depression, tried to bring him a wife because he got deported to New France. It wasn't only a change of environment; it was a change of climate. A lot of people were afraid of him in his community, the community where he stayed. Not only was he a person of African descent, but the people were afraid of him because that's he did for a living. He killed for a living, and those are religious days, very religious days in Canadian history. So someone that kills for a living, even though you kill on behalf of the government, the king, or the crown, this is still a job that's you're probably a demon, like you're demon like, or you're perceived as one at least. So yeah, so Mathieu Léveillé. And then this would take us also, so Mathieu Léveillé would be, he would die in 1743 at Hôpital Hôtel Dieu de Québec. He would die at a depression. They tried to bring him a wife. By the time the wife arrived, he had died of depression. I guess he went to the hospital a lot. This is where he received lots of care, I guess you could say that. In 1760, the British Conquest. So prior to this year, the British had already taken the Plaine d'Abraham in Quebec City. So this one is much more of a peaceful, one of the most peaceful conquests that you would see. Took place in Old Montreal. What's really interesting about the British Conquest is that it takes us to Article 47, which I'm going to read to you guys. Translated, of course, the Negroes and the Pawnees. So the Pawnees is the pejorative term they use for indigenous slaves. So people of the native that were enslaved, they would call them Pawnees because of the tribe Pawnees that would get captured a lot, and then they would use the term to to deem them. I guess if you're a native and you're enslaved, you're a Pawnee, even though the Pawnees weren't all slaves. The Negroes and the Pawnees of both sexes will stay in their quality of slaves in the possession of the French and Canadians to whom they belong. It'll be up to them to keep them in service of their colony, or to sell them. And they can also continue to raise them in the Christian, Catholic, or Roman Catholic, or Roman religion, according except them who are going to be made prisoners. So if you have a prisoner, of course, you do whatever you want with him. If you have one that you want to keep at home, he's still your slave. He or she belongs to you. That's really up to you. You get to keep your language. You get to keep your religion, and therefore, this would also start a social hierarchy where then you have the British domination, which they call it, and then at the same time, even though you have the French Canadian, which now are a conquered people, they still get to keep their slaves. So these are different layers of oppression and what is rooted in historically speaking. And yeah, so this is Article 47, taken from the archives of the city of Montreal. In 1760, this would lead to the Treaty of Paris. In 1763, that same Treaty of Paris, closely linked to the proclamation line that the Continentals wouldn't want to accept. It would start the Jumonville affair between British North America with the French soldiers and the Continental Army, or the British Army, in the Continental Army. And then George Washington would emerge out of that. 1776, you guys see the size of the province of Quebec. The Indian Reserve, which they call it, is where the natives. So also Continentals weren't really happy with the Indian reserves. Crispus Attucks. So all of that history is closely linked to what took place in Quebec City in 1759, Plaine d'Abraham, how the conquest, the British conquest of the Quebec City in Montreal, 1759 and 1760. My name is Rito Joseph. Hopefully you enjoy my presentation. Thank you very much. These are my information. You can follow me on social medias, Instagram and Facebook, or my website, www.ritojoseph.com.
Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation, Rito. My name is Madeline, and I am a grade 10 student in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
And hi, everyone. My name is Christine.
Hi,
I'm a grade 11 student from Ottawa, Ontario. We are so excited you all join us today and would like to open up the floor to questions for the next 10 minutes. Please send us your questions using the Q&A box. So the first question we had is from a teachers, and they're asking, my students are asking about the use of the word Negro and how to navigate around what historical context and what is appropriate.
So the word Negro itself, it's not a word that we can take out of history because it belongs to an era. But also, I think it should be used carefully. I think that people that want to use the word first have to research about the word itself, and I have to have a level of understanding on, because essentially what you will say about the word to the people that you'll be teaching, you will be implementing something in their brain, in their mind that can duplicate. And I believe that it's a word that I think we need to, if we want to talk about it, I think we need to talk about the whole context in which it involves, colonialism, and yeah, capitalism, and the whole history that has to do with it. Yeah. I don't know if that answers the question or.
Yes, thank you so much. Our next question is, how do you take all of the archival material and research and string it together into a story?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, you have to be aware of, of different historical events parallel to what you're researching, which means that, I don't know, for example, if you're researching something that happened in 1991 or 1967 or any year, it's good to know what else took place in the decade. It's good to know what took place that same year. It's good to know what took place that same century and how it shaped the story that you're going to be talked about. Yeah, so I believe it's just really working around your subject.
So, and next question that we have, so we live in a time where information can be accessed in so many ways. Can you speak to the importance of knowing where your information comes from and when doing research?
Yeah, definitely. I take my information as I go to National Archives. I read books. I take a lot of my archives from books. A lot of informations are on the internet, but are not necessarily, I wouldn't say they're hidden, but it's not something that you can easily find. So me, I like to read a lot of books, yeah, The Hanging of Marie Joseph Angélique, for example, or by Dr. Afro Cooper, or Black Then by Dr. Frank Mackey, yeah, but definitely go to National Archives and keep, the main subject in the middle of this whole mind mapping that I guess you'll be doing.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, what inspired you to get into this topic?
The need of I would say it doesn't exist, but it's not a mainstream subject. It's not something that we hear about. Most of what I talk about, I didn't even know as a child growing up. You see, so for me, it's about leaving a legacy for the younger generation to know that we also have a history here and we have a perspective, and when it changes from province to provinces, and if we can now put this together and understand that this an identity in itself. For me, that's what it was rooted in, because growing up, we always felt excluded. Where I came from, the neighborhood I came from, we always felt excluded. And I felt like in order to really maybe not belong, but in order to at least be rooted in something, you have to know about the local history that surrounds you and how it affects you, and and where you situate yourself historically speaking in a society.
So our next question, so can you dive into this further? Why do you think it's important to tell stories that are representative of the diverse backgrounds and experiences of Canadians?
Because multiculturalism is at the it's at the genesis of Canada. As we saw, it starts with a Black man, a person of African descent, introducing a Caucasian or European to an indigenous or a native. You see what I mean? And of course, we don't want to romanticize the history too, to say, oh, he introduced them. And we know it's a peaceful introduction, but we know what ensued after. But at the same time, it's for people to understand, even prior to, European colonization, you always had a lot of, tribes living here and, having different backgrounds, coexisting, sharing the land, sharing the resources. And we don't want it to be seen as if this is something new here, because it has existed prior to, European colonization of this land.
Thank you. Our next question. If you were talking to a student who was interested in diving deeper into the history of a topic, what advice would you give them?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, of course. If you were talking to a student who was interested in diving deeper into the history of a topic, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I would say work, research the subject that you feel matters to you, or that you feel could bring a change or an impact, or that you feel could, it's a dead angle, or that you feel that, people don't really pay attention to. At times, people may not pay attention to it, but if it matters to you, then it's worth researching, and it's worth, if you can find out, I don't know what you really want to work on. Is it for a project? Is it for, I don't know, a movie, to write a book? Is it for your personal knowledge? That's really up to you to know. But I'd say research, read the books about it, find the articles, watch the documentaries. Yeah, do the work. Yeah, it'll pay off. Yeah.
So can you tell us more about Black Montreal Experiences? How do you start this? I'm sorry, how did you start this? And what is your story?
Well, it's a good question. Well, for me, I always felt like, there was a need here for, to explain Afro-descendant presence. As you guys could see, the presence of Black people in Montreal dates back to at least 300 years, right? And it's just really fascinating to me how, we don't know, don't understand, nor do we pay attention um, to our side of, history here, or local history per se, because we do recognize African American history more than we recognize Black Canadian history. And for me, I feel like, I don't know, man, it's kind of hard to, picture yourself in a society if you don't historically exist in it. And if, you see what I mean? So for me, it was that need of, showcasing and not only the history to exist or to, to have a place, but really, I mean, some of the culture that you guys see in Montreal, it was started by Black people. Montreal is known today as the international jazz city. That came from the area now known as Little Burgundy, and it was a Black settlement, one of those Black settlement where, Black activism in Montreal is rooted in since the late 19th centuries. And I feel like, erasing that part of history, then it would erase Oscar Peterson and Oliver Jones and the whole era of, segregated Montreal, giving birth to, major Black-owned jazz clubs, because we don't tell the history, then people don't really know. So when you have billions of people coming from all over the world to Montreal for the International Jazz Festival, they have no idea where it originated from. So I think for me, that's really important, because we don't get the benefit off of that culture that, we create or we establish, yeah, I think, we need to share those stories, and we need to talk about it, and we need to act upon the knowledge that we have about them too. Yeah.
Our next question, are there any documentaries that you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, in regards to what we talked about, or in general, or
I would say just in general.
yeah, look up Ninth Floor from Mina Shu, if I'm not mistaken. It's about the Sir George Williams affair, so the Concordia riot in 1969, with Professor Perry Jones, which would fail his Black students, and they um, they took it to the dean's office, and the dean wouldn't believe them, and they backed the professor, so they occupied the computer room, and that ensued into it was a peaceful protest that, and then the police ended up, making it a physical altercation, and then a fire broke out, and then they got locked in the room, the computer room, while it was a fire. So look it up. It's about also the '60s in Montreal, and and the movements, the FLQ, what was going on in Canada as well, in the world too. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So this is going to be our last question. So how has the knowledge you've gained through your research and experiences directly impacted your outlook on life?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there's maybe I'm a bit more patient with people, and maybe I tend to want to understand more about the people, and not just not just judge them, and not just it makes me want to have a deeper understanding of what's going on, and why, it's why we have certain issues maybe in our society. Not to say I can fix them, or not to say I have an answer, but at least to, take a closer look at what's going on. And yeah, also, to keep us human, and yeah, that's knowing our history. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Madeline and Christine, for your help with today's Q&A, and thank you, Rito, for all these answers. I just really want to express my gratitude to you for participating in today's event. Your presentation was extremely informative and just really shared an element of Canadian history that many don't know about. I also appreciate all your careful answers to these questions, and reflecting on your own experience and your own what advice you would give to some of the students who are watching us today. And to all of those students and to all of our teachers who are watching, whether you're in the classroom or you're at home, thank you so much for joining us.